created a legal structure that kept her assets safe while her husband's were being used as collateral for loans he knew nothing about. The timing was not a coincidence. The structure was not an accident. Simone hired a criminal defense attorney 3 days after the SEC contacted her. She didn't call Marshall. She didn't call Dorian. Dorian found out through a brief Wall Street Journal item about the SEC investigation. He saw his mother's name in the second paragraph. He saw the trust. He saw the dates. He sat with his phone in his hand for a long time. Then he called his father. For the first time in 4 months, Marshall picked up on the second ring. Dorian didn't speak for 10 seconds. "Dad," he finally said, "I didn't know." Marshall closed his eyes. He didn't say it was okay. He didn't say he forgave him. He said, "I know," and he meant it. He had spent 22 years building housing for families, and he understood that the structures people build to protect themselves aren't always the ones that keep them safe. Dorian had protected himself by choosing the parent with the money. It had been a calculation. Marshall didn't blame him for the math. He blamed himself for building a life where the math was all that was left to do. Simone hosted a Saturday brunch at her Upper West Side apartment every month for 9 years. 12 women, same table, same caterer. She sent invitations on the first Monday of every month, and the replies always came back within hours. Always yes, always 12. The month after the SEC investigation became public, she sent the invitations, ordered the flowers, had the caterer prepare for 12. She set the table herself that morning. 12 plates, 12 glasses, 12 linen napkins folded the way she had learned from a magazine 15 years earlier. Nobody came. Not one reply. Not one apology. Not one message saying something came up. 12 empty chairs around a table set for 12. Simone sat at the head of that table for 40 minutes before standing up to clear the plates herself. The New York State Bar Association opened a review of her license 3 weeks after the SEC filing. Her firm released a statement saying Simone Reeves was no longer affiliated with them, using the word affiliated the way you use a word when you want to make someone sound like they were never really there. Her license was suspended pending investigation. No client would retain an attorney whose name appeared in a federal fraud filing. The phone stopped ringing the same way Marshall's had. Slowly at first, then all at once. Vernon Ashford was arrested on a Wednesday morning in his Park Avenue office. He was escorted out through the lobby. The security guard held the door. A photographer from the Journal was already on the sidewalk. Vernon looked at the ground the way people look at the ground when they're calculating what comes next and realizing the calculation has stopped working. Simone called Marshall on a Thursday evening. His phone lit up on the counter in Nain's kitchen, where he had been helping prep for the next morning. He saw her name. He looked at it through 6 full rings. He did not pick up. Not because he was angry. The anger had come and stayed and then left, the way weather leaves. What replaced it was not forgiveness and not bitterness. It was nothing. He had nothing left to say to her. Not because she had hurt him, she had, but because the person she had hurt no longer existed. The man who had needed Simone's approval, who had confused admiration for love. That man had disappeared somewhere between the bench in the park and the food cart and the 7 days of silence Nain had given him without asking for anything in return. He put the phone face down on the counter and went back to chopping onions. Marshall started working at the food cart on a Monday. Nain hadn't asked him to. He showed up at 5 in the morning when she was loading the cart and started carrying trays without saying anything. She looked at him. She didn't say no. He didn't know how to fry chicken. He didn't know the oil temperature. He burned the first 3 pieces. She threw them out without comment. He got the 4th one right. She nodded. That was the entire training program. He had managed a portfolio worth $380 million. He had signed checks larger than Nain's annual revenue. He had sat in rooms where deals worth more than every food cart in New York City combined were discussed over lunch. And he had never once understood what it took to earn $700 standing over a fryer in 90-degree heat on a Harlem sidewalk for 11 hours. Every dollar Nan made was connected to a physical act. Flour on her hands, oil on her apron, sweat on her forehead. No spreadsheet between her effort and her income. No abstraction, no leverage. Just a woman and a skillet and a line of people who came back because the food was real. One afternoon, Name's daughter Jolene was sitting on an overturned crate doing homework while the line formed at the cart. She looked up from her textbook and said, "Mr. Marshall, can you help me with this?" It was a personal finance assignment. Budgeting, income and expenses, savings goals. The kind of worksheet that teaches 16-year-olds what money means before they have any. Marshall sat down on the crate beside her. He took the worksheet. He read through it slowly. Then he began explaining. Not the way he had explained tax credit structures to investors, not the way he had presented at conferences. He explained it the way his father had explained money to him at the kitchen table on Holly Street. This is what comes in, this is what goes out. The difference is what keeps you going. He spent 45 minutes on that worksheet. He drew diagrams on napkins. He used Nane's cart as the example. Revenue, cost of goods, fixed costs, variable costs, margin. He made it real, specific, something a 16-year-old could hold in her hands and actually use. He had never done that for Dorian. He had paid for Dorian's education, funded his MBA, but he had never sat beside his son and explained how money actually worked in a voice that was patient and slow and meant for one person. He had been too busy building, too busy managing, too busy being Marshall O to be Dorian's father. He sat on that crate next to Jolene and taught her what Eugene had taught him, and understood for the first time that the note he had written 10 years ago was more true than he knew. The food was worth more than what I paid, worth more than $1,400, worth more than $2.1 billion, worth a second chance at learning what mattered. The restitution came through on a Friday. Vernon Ashford had been convicted on 14 counts of wire fraud, 6 counts of securities fraud, and 3 counts of money laundering. His assets had been seized and frozen. Total recovery distributed across all identified victims. $61 million. Marshall's share was $23 million, not close to $2.1 billion, but he was not the same man who had needed $2.1 billion. He was a man who had learned to fry chicken, chop onions, and teach a 16-year-old how to balance a budget on the back of a napkin. He looked at Clarence. "How much do I need to do what I'm thinking of doing?" Clarence leaned back. "What are you thinking of doing?" Marshall told him. Clarence sat with it. "That would work," he said. The building was on Frederick Douglass Boulevard between 125th and 126th, a former garment warehouse, 3 stories, 12,000 square feet, empty for 4 years. The holding company that owned it had been trying to sell at $2.1 million for 3 years. Marshall offered $1.4. They took it within a week. He had the plans drawn up by Gail Okafor, who ran a small architecture practice on Lenox Avenue and understood what the neighborhood needed because she had lived in it for 30 years. The Thibodeau OA Community Kitchen, a food hall on the ground floor with 14 vendor stalls. A shared commercial kitchen on the second floor, available to permitted vendors who couldn't afford their own equipment. A business incubator on the third floor offering mentorship, accounting support, and access to small business banking for food entrepreneurs who had never had a bank account in their business name. The model was simple: low fixed costs for vendors, shared infrastructure, professional support for people who knew how to cook but didn't know how to file taxes or negotiate a lease or build credit. The kind of structure that turns a food cart into a food business. The kind of support Marshall had spent 22 years building in housing and had never thought to build in food. He showed Nain the plans on a Tuesday evening at her kitchen table. Jolene was in the next room doing homework. Marshall unrolled the blueprints and laid them flat between the salt shaker and the napkin holder. Nain looked at the layout. She looked at the name printed across the top. She was quiet for a long time. "You are putting my name on a building. Your food put me back on my feet," Marshall said. "Your name goes first." Thibodeau OA. Not O.A. Thibodeau. Her name first, his name second, the way it should have been from the beginning, because she was the one who had shown up with a plate of food and asked nothing in return. And that is the kind of thing that deserves to go first. Nain put her hand flat on the blueprint. The same gesture Marshall had made 10 years ago on a sidewalk in New Orleans when he had put his hand over the $200. The same gesture. Different decade, different city, same meaning. Marshall established a scholarship fund for the children of food vendors in Harlem, 4 full tuition scholarships annually at CUNY colleges. Jolene was the first recipient. The acceptance letter came from Hunter College, biology pre-med track. She read it at the kitchen table. She looked at her mother. Nain looked back at her daughter. Neither of them said anything. The letter sat on the table between them, next to the blueprints, and the salt shaker, and the napkin holder. A kitchen table in a Harlem apartment where everything real was happening. Dorian A. showed up on opening day. He hadn't called ahead. He took the train to 125th Street and walked 4 blocks to Frederick Douglass Boulevard and stood on the sidewalk outside the building with his hands in his pockets, reading the sign. His father's name was on it. Second, after Thibodeau. Dorian had grown up seeing his father's name first on everything, on the company, on the letterhead, on every building directory they had ever walked into. OA first, always first. Not here. Here his father's name came second, behind a woman Dorian had never heard of, behind a name he couldn't yet pronounce. He stood on that sidewalk and understood something he hadn't understood 6 months ago when he chose his mother's money over his father's phone call. The man who needed his name first on everything was gone. The man inside this building had chosen to put someone else's name ahead of his own. That wasn't weakness. That was something Dorian didn't have a word for yet. He walked in. The ground floor was full, 14 vendor stalls. The smell of frying oil and spices and rice and roasted peppers filled the room from wall to wall. People were eating at long communal tables. People were standing in lines. People were talking to vendors through open stall windows like they had been doing it for years, even though the doors had only opened that morning. Dorian found his father in the kitchen behind Nain's stall. Marshall was wearing a white apron. His sleeves were rolled up, flour on his hands, oil on the apron. He was lowering chicken into the fryer with tongs, the way someone does it when they've done it enough times to stop thinking about it. Dorian stood in the doorway. Marshall looked up, saw his son, then turned back to the fryer. Nobody told Dorian to come in. Nobody told him to leave. He walked to the counter. He took an apron from the hook on the wall and put it on. He stood next to his father. He didn't say sorry. He didn't explain. He just stood there. Marshall handed him the tongs. They worked side by side for the rest of the afternoon, frying chicken, plating orders, wiping down the counter, not talking, not needing to. The kitchen was loud and hot and full of the kind of work that doesn't require conversation. The kind of work Eugene O. had done every day on Holly Street, fixing pipes next to his son, not talking about love, just being there, showing up with your hands and staying until the work was done. That was how the OE men repaired things, not with apologies or speeches or presents, with labor, with standing next to someone and doing the work beside them until the silence between you stopped being empty and started being enough. Simone didn't come. She didn't call. Her story had ended in an apartment on the Upper West Side with 12 empty chairs and a table set for people who were never coming back. Not everyone returns. Not every thread gets tied. That is not a failure of the story. That is the story. Dorian stayed until closing. He helped stack the chairs and mop the floor. When the lights were off and the kitchen was clean, he stood outside on the sidewalk with his father. Neither of them spoke for a while. The street was dark. The sign above the door was lit from underneath. Thibodeau OA Community Kitchen. Dorian looked at it. "I like the name," he said. Marshall looked at the sign. "She earned it," he said. That was all. They walked to the subway together. Dorian went south. Marshall went north, 2 blocks to the rooming house on 125th Street where he still lived. Because he hadn't yet decided where to go next, and because the room had become familiar, and familiar was something he had learned not to waste. Vernon had his lawyers. Simone had her prenup. Dorian had his trust fund. Nain had a food card and a 10-year-old handwritten note folded inside a recipe written on the back of a church bulletin. Every one of those things was a kind of protection. Every one was designed to keep something safe. The lawyers protected Vernon until they couldn't. The prenup protected Simone until there was nothing left to protect.
The trust fund protected Dorian until it became the reason he stopped calling his father. The note protected Nain differently. It didn't protect her money or her assets. It protected something that has no line item on any balance sheet. It protected her belief that a stranger could be kind without wanting something back. And she carried that belief for 10 years, through a hurricane, through a move to a city where she knew nobody, through 3 years of pushing a food cart through rain and summer heat and winter cold on the sidewalks of Harlem. And when she saw the man who had written that note sitting on a park bench with nothing, she didn't calculate what he was worth. She calculated what he needed. A plate of food, a seat on the bench, someone to show up tomorrow and the day after and the day after that, without asking why. Vernon held the same financial tools Marshall held. One used them to build 1,400 homes for families who needed them. The other used them to steal $180 million from people who trusted him. The tools don't tell you who someone is. The way they used them does. Marshall Oy had $2.1 billion and lost it. He had a wife who left in 11 days. He had a son who chose the money. He had a partner who stole everything. And the person who saved him was a woman he had met once on a sidewalk in New Orleans who remembered what he had done with $200 and a handwritten note, and who showed up with a plate of chicken 10 years later and said, "Same time tomorrow." The people who leave when you have nothing were never there for you. The people who show up with a plate of food and ask nothing in return, those are the ones who were always there. You just couldn't see them when the room was full. You only see them when the room is empty and they're the only ones still standing in the doorway. Some people spend their lives protecting things that don't fit on paper. Marshall learned the hard way that the things worth protecting never did fit on paper. They fit in a kitchen. They fit in a handwritten note. They fit in a church bulletin recipe that travels from New Orleans to Harlem inside a cast iron skillet and a woman who never forgot. If someone showed up for you after 10 years, not because they owed you, not because they wanted something, but because they remembered what you did when they had nothing, would you trust it? Or would you wonder what they wanted? Leave your answer below. And if this story reminded you of someone who showed up for you when nobody else did, send it to them. They probably don't hear it enough. Subscribe and stay around. The next story is already waiting. 6 months after his wife walked out with a prenuptial agreement she had written herself, Marshall Oy was sitting on a bench in Marcus Garvey Park with $3,200 to his name and nowhere to be. A woman pushing a food cart stopped in front of him. She said his name. He didn't recognize her. She didn't expect him to. But the meal she was about to serve him would dismantle a $400 million fraud and give him back the one thing money had never managed to buy. She had been looking for him without knowing she was looking. The cart smelled like hot oil and onions caramelizing on cast iron, and something underneath both of those things that had no name but felt like a kitchen you grew up in. The last time she had seen this man, he had $2.1 billion to his name and a wife on his arm. Now he was sitting on a park bench in Harlem with nothing. Marshall was on the third bench from the north entrance of Marcus Garvey Park. He had been sitting there for 19 days. Same bench, same time, 4 in the afternoon, when the light came through the trees at an angle that made everything on the path look like it was trying to leave. He was 56 years old. He was wearing a charcoal suit that had cost $420 when he bought it. The jacket had not been pressed in weeks. The collar had gone soft. The shirt underneath was clean but wrinkled the way things get wrinkled when you wash them in a sink and hang them on a doorknob to dry. His shoes were Italian leather with the left heel worn down on the outside edge. He had not shaved in 2 weeks. His hands were folded in his lap. He was not reading, not looking at his phone. He was looking at the path the way people look at things when they are not really seeing them. The food cart came down the path from the south entrance. It moved slowly, one wheel pulling left with each step, making the woman behind it adjust her grip constantly. The cart was steel and white, with a handwritten sign: fried chicken, rice and beans, sweet tea. The letters were painted in red by someone who had taken their time with each one. The woman pushing it was named Thibodeau, 44 years old, white apron over a dark shirt, hair tied back with a cloth the color of cayenne. She had been selling food in this park for 3 years. She knew the regulars, the bench sitters, the ones who had money and the ones who didn't. She fed both. That was what her grandmother had done. That was what she was going to keep doing. She saw the man on the third bench and slowed the cart. She looked at him. She looked at his hands. She looked at the suit. She looked at his face. She stood still for a moment with both hands on the cart handle and did not move. She knew that face. She had seen it once, 10 years earlier, on a sidewalk in New Orleans, on a day when she had $40 left and a daughter who had not eaten since that morning. She had seen that face step out of a black car and walk toward her folding table and order a plate of food and eat it standing up on the curb like it was the best thing he had tasted in years. She said his name, not loudly, not like a question. She said it the way you say a word you have been carrying for a long time and finally have a reason to put down. He looked up. He did not recognize her. She had been one meal on one sidewalk on one afternoon a decade ago. He had been the man who changed her life with a handwritten note and $1,400. She pulled a container from the cart, fried chicken, rice, beans. She set it on the bench beside him without explaining and stood there. He looked at the container. He did not open it. He sat with it beside him the way you sit with something you are not sure you deserve. To understand what happened next, you need to understand who these two people were and how they had ended up within 10 feet of each other on this particular bench. Marshall O. grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment on Holly Street in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn. His father, Eugene, had come from Accra in 1971 with a trade certificate in plumbing and $600 his mother had sewn into the lining of his suitcase. Eugene got work within 2 weeks. He never stopped working after that. Marshall's mother died when he was 9. Pneumonia that started as a cough she said was nothing and turned into something that filled her lungs in 11 days. Eugene did not remarry. He worked 14 hours a day and came home every night and made dinner and checked Marshall's homework at the kitchen table with pipe grease still under his fingernails. The kitchen table was where everything important happened in that apartment, where Eugene told Marshall about Ghana, where he explained how money worked, where he showed him the pay stubs and the bills side by side every month and said, "This is what comes in and this is what goes out, and the difference is what keeps you alive." Marshall learned to read a balance sheet before he learned to drive. He went to City College on scholarship, no debt, because Eugene had put $40 a month into a savings account for 18 years without missing once. Marshall did the math later. His father had given up coffee and lunch for 18 years to make that number work. He never told Marshall. Marshall found the deposit slips in a drawer after Eugene had a stroke at 71. Marshall started in commercial real estate, small deals at first, a duplex in Crown Heights, a 4-unit in East New York. He understood something most developers his age didn't. There was money in affordable housing. Not magazine cover money, the kind that built slowly and lasted. He learned the federal tax credit system. The government offered credits to developers who built housing for low-income tenants. The credits were worth more than the rent. A developer could build 200 units at rents working families could actually pay and earn a solid return through credits that banks and investors would buy. It wasn't charity. It was a business model that happened to serve people who needed serving. He explained it to his father once over dinner. Eugene listened carefully. Then he said the only thing he ever said about Marshall's work. "So you make money by building homes people can afford?" Marshall said, "Yes." Eugene nodded. "That is the only kind of building worth doing."
Marshall built OK Capital Partners from a one-room office on Fulton Street in Bed-Stuy, one assistant, one phone line. He grew it over 22 years into one of the largest affordable housing developers in the northeastern United States. 1,400 units across 4 states.
His name in the Wall Street Journal, twice. His face in Black Enterprise, 3 times. He sat on boards. He gave speeches. He hired people from the same blocks where his father had fixed pipes. He married Simone Reeves at 33. She was a corporate attorney at a firm on Park Avenue. Smart, precise, someone who talked about ambition the way Eugene talked about work. Marshall admired her because she reminded him of himself. He did not see the difference between someone who admired what he had built and someone who admired what he was worth. By the time he understood the difference, it had cost him everything. 10 years before Marshall sat on that bench, Naim Thibodeau was standing on a sidewalk on Ursuline's Avenue in the Tremaine neighborhood of New Orleans. Folding table, 2-burner gas stove, cast-iron skillet, and a recipe her grandmother had written on the back of a church bulletin. She was 34. Her daughter Jolene was 6, sitting on a folding chair behind the table with a coloring book and a cup of water that had been her lunch because there was nothing else that morning. Nain had $40 in her apron pocket. She had spent $31 on chicken thighs, oil, flour, and seasoning. She had 9 left. If she sold enough plates to cover tomorrow's supplies, she could keep going. If she didn't, she would have to figure out something else. And she didn't have something else to figure out. The chicken was almost done. The oil was at the right temperature. She could tell by the sound her grandmother had taught her. You don't need a thermometer, you listen. When the oil stops talking and starts whispering, it's ready. She had 6 plates left when the black car pulled up. A Lincoln Town Car, clean in the way that means someone else washes it. A man stepped out, tall, dark suit, someone who looked like he was between meetings. He stood on the sidewalk, looked at the table, and the handwritten sign, and the skillet, and didn't move for a moment. Then he walked over and ordered 1 plate for $8. Nain served it in a styrofoam container with a plastic fork. He stood right there on the curb and opened it and ate, standing 3 feet from the stove, without sitting down, without walking away. Halfway through, he said, "Who taught you this?" "My grandmother," Nain said. "She passed 4 years ago." He nodded. He finished the plate. He looked at the table. He looked at Jolene on her folding chair with the coloring book. He reached into his jacket and put $200 on the table. "That is too much," Nain said. "It is not enough," he said. She pushed the money back. He put his hand flat over the bills and looked at her, not smiling, not performing, just looking, the way you look at someone when you are trying to say something that doesn't fit into words. Then he walked back to the car, and it pulled away. Nain stood there on Ursuline's Avenue with $200 on a folding table and the oil still whispering in the skillet. 3 days later, a lawyer called. A man named Marshall Oy had paid 6 months of rent on a fixed store at the French market in the French Quarter. He had also put a deposit on commercial kitchen equipment, a prep table, a fryer, a proper ventilation hood. Total cost, $1,400. No conditions, no contract, no repayment terms. There was a handwritten note the lawyer read to her over the phone. The food was worth more than what I paid. This is the rest. Nain did not have his number or his address. She had a note, a stall at the French market, and equipment she couldn't have afforded in 5 years of saving. She kept the note. She folded it into a square and put it inside the recipe her grandmother had written on the back of that church bulletin. She carried both for 10 years. She built everything that came after on the foundation of not forgetting. The stall at the French market became what Nain had always believed it could be. She hired 2 people. She built a lunch crowd that lined up before the market opened. Jolene grew up behind that counter, doing homework on a folding chair between the fryer and the register. Then Hurricane Ida came through in August 2021. The market flooded. The equipment was destroyed. Insurance covered part of it, not enough. After 3 months cleaning up and sleeping on her sister's couch in Baton Rouge, Nain made a decision. She wasn't going to rebuild in a place that could be taken by water again.
She was going to go somewhere the ground didn't flood. She moved to New York, Harlem. She bought a used food cart from a man in the Bronx, got her permits, and started selling on 125th Street and in Marcus Garvey Park. The same food, the same recipe, the same chicken her grandmother had taught her, and that Marshall A. had tasted once on a sidewalk a decade before. Now, back to the park bench. Nain didn't tell Marshall any of this the first day. She set the food down. She said, "Same time tomorrow." He nodded. She came back the next day, and the day after that. Day 5, he said, "Thank you." 2 words, the first he had spoken to her since they met again. Day 6, she sat on the bench beside him for a few minutes. Neither of them said anything. Day 7, he ate while she was still there. He tasted cayenne and honey and something sweet underneath that he couldn't name. Something that tasted like food made by someone who meant it. He didn't know he was tasting a recipe written on the back of a church bulletin in 1974. Day 8, he started talking. He told her about Vernon Ashford, the CFO he had trusted for 10 years. He told her about the loans, about the personal guarantee clauses he had signed without reading them because Vernon had managed the numbers, and every number had always been right. He told her about Simone, who had filed for divorce 11 days after the company collapsed, and had called her divorce attorney before she called her husband. About Dorian, 24, MBA from Columbia, who had chosen the trust fund over his father and hadn't called in 4 months. He told her all of it on that bench with an empty food container between them and the afternoon light coming through the trees. Nain listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't offer advice. She didn't say she was sorry. When he was done, she was quiet for a while. Then she asked one question. "Do you still have the records?" He didn't understand at first. Records of what? "The financial records from your company. Do you still have them?" He did. He had a portable hard drive in his suitcase at the rooming house. He had kept copies of everything: quarterly reports, loan documents, fund allocations. The way you keep things when you don't know what else to do with them. Not as strategy, as habit. "I know someone," Nain said. Clarence Abrams was 62 years old, with an office on Adam Clayton Powell Boulevard and reading glasses on a chain around his neck. He ate fried chicken from Nain's cart every Tuesday at 12:15, was particular about the breast piece, always asked for extra hot sauce, always paid exact change, and always told Nain the chicken was better than his mother's, and that if she ever repeated that, he would deny it. He was a forensic accountant and attorney specializing in white-collar financial fraud. He had spent 30 years following money through structures designed to make money disappear. Shell companies, offshore trusts, nominee directors. He understood them the way a plumber understands pipes. You find a source, you trace the flow, you find where it leaks. Nain brought Marshall to his office on a Thursday. She didn't call ahead. She brought 2 containers of chicken, set one on the reception desk, carried the other to Clarence's door, and knocked. "Mr. Abrams, this man needs 5 minutes." Clarence looked at Marshall. He looked at the chicken. He waved them in. Marshall opened the hard drive on Clarence's desk and walked him through the files. Clarence read through them slowly. He put his glasses on. He took them off. He put them on again. He didn't speak for 22 minutes. Then he looked up. "This is not bankruptcy. This is theft. There is a difference, and the difference is prison time." He explained it plainly. When someone takes a company into debt through bad decisions, that's failure. When someone redirects funds into shell projects, forges allocation reports, and buries personal guarantee clauses in loan covenants that the CEO never approved, that's fraud. The first is a business matter. The second is a federal matter. The line between them is intent, and the documents on that hard drive showed intent on every page. Clarence took the case, not out of charity, but because Vernon Ashford was exactly the kind of man he had spent 30 years training to catch. He made one phone call that afternoon. The person on the other end had been waiting 3 years for someone to bring them a case exactly like this. A senior enforcement attorney at the SEC regional office in New York
who had been building a file on irregularities in the affordable housing tax credit market, but had been unable to find a victim willing to come forward with documentation. Most fraud victims don't know they're victims. They think they failed. They think the market turned. They think they made bad decisions. They don't think someone stole from them, because the theft was designed to look like misfortune. Marshall had the documentation. Clarence had the expertise.
The SEC had the jurisdiction.
Within 48 hours of Clarence submitting the initial filing, a forensic audit team was assigned. They traced fund flows from OA Capital Partners through 7 shell companies registered in Delaware, names that sounded legitimate. Northeast Development Holdings, Atlantic Community Partners, Harlem Gateway LLC. Behind every name was a mailbox and a registered agent and nothing else. Vernon Ashford had moved $47 million through these entities over 5 years, purchasing luxury properties in his wife's name and in the names of associates who existed only on paper. He had also convinced 3 other investors to pledge personal assets as collateral for developments that were never built. Total exposure across all victims, $180 million. The investigation reached Simone 6 weeks after it began. The forensic team found a trust.
It had been created 4 years before the divorce.
Managed by Vernon, holding $2.3 million of Simone's personal assets. The trust was referenced in the prenuptial agreement she had written herself, the same prenup that had protected her when she left Marshall. The connection wasn't proof that Simone had participated in the fraud, but it was proof that she knew Vernon, that she had entrusted her own money to him, that she had.